Before Israel conquered Canaan, there existed a hidden spiritual world marked by forbidden rituals and practices that the Bible itself describes as abominations. Contact with the dead was not symbolic. It was a central part of a culture that influenced the entire region. But what truly happened in these rituals, and why was the order given to destroy everything without leaving a trace? Today you will learn the historical and spiritual truth behind one of the most severe decisions recorded in the Scriptures. Subscribe now and prepare to discover details that are almost never explained. Before continuing with the video, do you want to strengthen your prayer life and also help our channel grow? I have prepared a material with more than 50 special prayers to guide you. Click the link in the description and help our project to spread the word of Christ. You have probably already heard about the conquest of Canaan, but perhaps you have never understood why God ordered something so radical. The answer was not in the Canaanite armies. It was not in their walls. It was in something that could not be seen, a spiritual system where the dead were consulted as oracles, children were burned as offerings, and priests believed they could tear the veil between two worlds. Israel was not just entering a land, it was entering a supernatural battlefield. To measure what comes next, you must forget the simplified image you may have built regarding ancient peoples. The Canaanites were not primitive tribes living in tents. They were sophisticated civilizations, with walled cities that existed for more than 1,000 years before Abraham was born. Ugarit, one of the main Canaanite cities, possessed libraries with thousands of clay tablets. Their scribes mastered multiple languages. Their artisans produced jewelry that rivaled that of Egypt. And their priests administered a religious system so complex that it influenced cultures throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Consider the scenario. We are around 1,400 years before Christ. Egypt is still raising pyramids. Mesopotamia refines its laws. And between these two giants, in a strip of land that connects 3 continents, Canaan flourishes. It was not a unified nation, but a mosaic of independent city-states, each with its king, its army, and its gods. Hazor, to the north, had an estimated population of 20,000 inhabitants and occupied an area of 80 hectares. Megiddo controlled the most important pass between Egypt and Assyria. Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, already had walls when most people still lived as nomads. What united these cities was not politics, it was religion. At the top of the Canaanite pantheon was El, the creator god, imagined as an old man with a white beard who ruled from the top of a cosmic mountain. Below him, dozens of deities vied for power and influence. Baal, the lord of storms, was the most popular. His name appears more than 90 times in the Old Testament alone, almost always as a warning. Asherah, the goddess of fertility, had her sacred poles scattered on hills throughout the region. Mot, the god of death, ruled the underworld. And Molech, this name you must remember, demanded a type of offering that to this day causes horror. But here is what many do not realize. Canaanite religion was not just about worshipping statues or holding festivals, it was a complete system of spiritual manipulation. Canaanite priests genuinely believed they could control invisible forces through specific rituals, that they could guarantee rains through incantations, that they could heal diseases through sacrifices, and, more disturbingly, that they could communicate with the dead. Necromancy was not a marginal practice in Canaan. It was institutionalized. There were professionals specialized in this. The texts of Ugarit mention a class of priests called knowers of spirits, who were consulted by kings and generals before important battles. When a monarch needed to make a crucial decision, it was not enough to consult living advisors. It was necessary to hear the ancestors. It was believed that the dead had access to knowledge that the living did not possess, that they could see the future and reveal hidden secrets. How did this work in practice? Archaeologists have found disturbing clues. In excavations throughout the region, underground structures connected to temples have been discovered that seem to have served as invocation chambers. Some were circular in shape, approximately 3 meters in diameter, and presented remains of ritual fires, bones of sacrificed animals, and fragments of pottery used for libations. Scholars believe that mediums descended into these chambers, performed specific rituals involving blood and incense, and entered altered states of consciousness where they supposedly received messages from the world of the dead. Consider the situation of an ordinary Canaanite family. When someone died, the body was not simply buried and forgotten. In many cases, it was buried under the house itself, sometimes directly under the floor where the family slept. Excavations in Megiddo revealed more than 30 domestic burials in a single residential area. The dead were placed in a fetal position, surrounded by personal objects, vessels with food, and small statuettes representing protective gods. Why do this? Because death was not seen as an end, it was a transition, and the evidence for this is overwhelming. At Tel Rehov, excavations revealed a funerary complex where 37 bodies were found in successive layers, each new burial carefully positioned so as not to disturb the previous ones. Archaeologists found evidence of repeated visits over decades, with new offerings placed over the old ones. Some families maintained this ritual for 3 or 4 generations. The living could not abandon their dead, or perhaps they feared what would happen if they did. The Canaanites believed that their ancestors continued to exist in a parallel plane called Sheol, or the land of no return. But unlike the later Israelite view, where Sheol was a place of silence and forgetting, the Canaanites imagined their dead as active entities, capable of influencing the world of the living. A satisfied ancestor could protect the family, guarantee abundant harvests, bless births. A neglected or irritated ancestor could bring disease, sterility, misfortune. This created a spiritual economy based on fear and dependence. Regularly, families needed to feed their dead, literally. Archaeologists found ceramic tubes installed vertically in tombs, creating a passage between the surface and the corpse. Through these tubes, the living poured wine, oil, milk, and animal blood, believing that the dead consumed the essence of these offerings. In some tombs, evidence was found of ritual meals performed directly over the sepulchres, where family members ate together with their dead ancestors. But not all dead were treated equally. Kings and priests received special treatments that bordered on divinization. Texts from Ugarit describe rituals where the spirit of a deceased king was officially elevated to the status of Rephaim, a category of powerful dead who became almost gods. These Rephaim were invoked collectively in state ceremonies, as if they formed a council of divine ancestors that legitimized the power of the reigning dynasty. The living king did not rule alone. He ruled backed by generations of dead kings. Observe what this meant for the power structure. To question the king was to question the ancestors. To challenge the established order was to offend the dead. The system created a web of control that went beyond life, where even death served to maintain hierarchies. And then there was Moloch. The name probably derives from Melech, the Semitic word for king, purposely distorted by Hebrew scribes, who replaced the vowels with those of Bosheth, which means shame. Every pronunciation of the name carried the embedded condemnation, the king of shame. This was not just theological criticism, it was documented horror. If necromancy represented the attempt to extract power from the dead, the cult of Moloch represented something even darker, the offering of life in exchange for divine favor. Historians debate exactly how these rituals functioned, but the evidence is disturbing. In Carthage, a Phoenician colony that inherited Canaanite practices, archaeologists excavated a sanctuary called Tophet, where they found more than 20,000 urns containing cremated remains of children. The ages ranged from newborns to children of approximately 4 years. The Bible does not exaggerate when it mentions the Valley of Hinnom. This valley, located on the outskirts of Jerusalem, became so associated with abominable practices that its name in Hebrew, Gehenna, came to mean hell itself in later Jewish literature. Jeremiah chapter 7 describes what happened there. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. The prophet was not using symbolic language. He was documenting literal horror. How does a society reach this point? How do parents hand over children to be burned? The answer lies in the internal logic of the Canaanite system. If the gods controlled absolutely everything, rains, harvests, fertility, military victory, then nothing was more valuable than securing their favor. And if smaller offerings worked for smaller requests, Larger offerings would be necessary for larger crises. Prolonged drought, larger offering. Threat of invasion, larger offering. Devastating epidemic. Logic led inevitably to the unthinkable. Nothing was more precious than a child. Therefore, nothing would guarantee a better divine response. The priests who administered these rituals were not monsters in their own perception. They were religious specialists who believed they were saving their community through necessary sacrifices. The families who handed over their children were not necessarily cruel. They were imprisoned in a belief system that transformed murder into devotion. It is here that you begin to understand why God spoke so harshly about Canaan. When Deuteronomy lists the forbidden practices, the text is not being arbitrarily severe. It is describing a real system that Israel would encounter and that represented existential, spiritual, and moral danger. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. The list is not random. Each item corresponds to a practice archaeologically documented in Canaan. But there was another element that made the situation even more complex: fertility rituals. Baal was worshipped as the god who sent rains, and his consort Asherah represented the generating force of the earth. Canaanite magical logic proposed that ritual sexual acts could stimulate cosmic fertility. If humans practiced sex in the temples, the gods would be inspired to do the same, and from this celestial union would come the rains that fecundated the earth. This gave rise to sacred prostitution, practiced by both women and men in the temples of Canaan. It was not prostitution in the modern commercial sense, although it involved payment. It was ritual. Worshippers believed that by uniting sexually with a priest or priestess of the temple, they were participating in a cosmic act that would benefit the entire community. The temples of Asherah, with their sacred poles, became centers of these practices. Measure this. A religion that normalized child sacrifice, necromancy, and the ritualization of sex was not just theologically different from what Israel proposed. It was a complete system of life that shaped every aspect of Canaanite existence. And it is into this world that Israel arrives. 40 years in the desert had transformed a band of slaves into a nation with laws, priesthood, and a defined identity. But nothing had prepared them for the cultural shock they would encounter. Canaan was rich, established, sophisticated. Its cities had impressive walls. Those of Jericho measured approximately 6 meters in thickness. Its fields were fertile, irrigated by canal systems dating back centuries. Its merchants controlled routes connecting empires, accumulating wealth visible in every house and temple. In comparison, Israel was a people without land, without cities, without agricultural experience. They knew herding of flocks, not cultivation of vineyards. They knew how to pitch tents, not build houses. Their only advantage was invisible, a covenant with a God who promised to be sufficient. The temptation would not be just military, it would be religious. Think of the perspective of an ordinary Israelite. You spent 4 decades eating manna in the desert. Now you're in a land that truly flows with milk and honey. Your new Canaanite neighbors have abundant harvests. They attribute this abundance to their rituals. Baal sends the rain, they say. Asherah blesses the land, the ancestors protect the families. Are you going to completely ignore what seems to work? Or are you going to perhaps incorporate some practices just to be sure? The Book of Judges documents exactly this process of gradual assimilation. It did not happen all at once. It was slow erosion. One generation served the Lord. The next knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel, and began to experiment with local gods. Altars to Baal appeared on the hills. Asherah poles were erected in high places. Practices that initially seemed complementary, worshipping Yahweh and the local gods, eventually replaced the original faith. The judges arose as a response to this cycle. Apostasy, oppression by neighboring peoples crying out to God, liberation through a chosen leader, temporary peace, and then new apostasy when the judge died. The cycle repeated for more than 300 years, demonstrating how difficult it was to maintain separation amidst constant cultural pressure. But the most critical period would come later, with the monarchy. When Israel asked for a king like the other nations, it was not just asking for a different political structure. It was asking to become more like its neighbors, and kings frequently married foreign princesses to seal diplomatic alliances. These princesses brought their gods. The most famous case is Jezebel, a Phoenician princess who became the wife of Ahab, king of Israel. She did not just bring the cult of Baal, she institutionalized it. Jezebel maintained 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah at the royal table, funded by the kingdom's treasury. She built temples. She persecuted prophets of Yahweh. She ordered the death of Elijah. Under her influence, Israel experienced its greatest spiritual crisis until then. On Mount Carmel, when Elijah faced the prophets of Baal, he was not just making a demonstration of power. He was trying to break a system that had captured the entire nation. The confrontation lasted an entire day. 450 prophets of Baal cried out from morning until noon. They cut themselves with knives and lancets, according to their custom, until blood gushed out. They entered trances. They shouted. They danced. They leaped upon the altar. Elijah, observing, began to mock. Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth, and must be awaked. It was calculated provocation. It exposed the total impotence of a deity who supposedly controlled storms but could not light a fire. Nothing happened. When Elijah finally prayed, a short, direct prayer without elaborate rituals, fire descended from heaven and consumed not only the sacrifice but the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water that soaked everything. The people present fell on their faces and declared, "The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God." But even this dramatic event did not solve the problem permanently. Jezebel remained in power. Apostasy continued in other generations. Solomon himself, the wisest king, ended his days building altars for the gods of his many foreign wives. If even he did not resist, what could be expected of the common people? Later prophets documented practices that prove how deep Canaanite influence penetrated. Isaiah mentions Israelites who sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens, following pagan rituals. Jeremiah found women baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, a title of Asherah, and declaring that when they did so they had prosperity, but when they stopped, misfortune came. Ezekiel, in a vision, saw elders of Israel worshipping images in secret chambers within the Temple of Jerusalem itself. 70 elders with censers in their hands, burning incense to figures of reptiles and detestable animals drawn on the walls. This was not ignorant folk religion. It was the elite participating. And necromancy never completely disappeared. The most famous case happened with Saul, the first king of Israel. On the eve of a crucial battle against the Philistines, terrified because God did not answer his inquiries through legitimate means, Saul sought a medium in Endor. He himself had banished such practices from the kingdom. Now disguised, he asked her to invoke the spirit of Samuel. What happened that night generates debate among scholars to this day. Something appeared. The medium screamed in fright when she saw a god ascending out of the earth. The biblical text describes a figure with the appearance of an old man covered with a mantle, exactly how Samuel dressed in life. Saul prostrated himself. A voice he identified as Samuel spoke, rebuking him for the consultation and prophesying his death the next day. "Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up?" asked the voice. And then came the sentence, "Tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me." Everything was fulfilled. Saul died. His sons died. The army was defeated. The narrative does not explain exactly what happened in supernatural terms. It does not say if it was truly Samuel or a deceiving spirit. What it shows is that the practice of consulting the dead was real, was sought even by kings, and led to destruction. Generations later, when the northern kingdom fell before Assyria in 722 before Christ, the biblical text summarizes the reason. The children of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, and followed the customs of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before them. And they made Asherahs, and served idols, and they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments. The list is essentially the same as in Deuteronomy. The ignored warning became a fulfilled accusation. The southern kingdom, Judah, lasted another 136 years, but not for being more faithful. Kings like Manasseh, who ruled for 55 years, the longest reign in the history of Judah, completely restored Canaanite practices. Manasseh rebuilt the high places of Baal that his father Hezekiah had demolished. He reared up Asherah poles. He set a carved image in the temple of Jerusalem. He practiced divination. He consulted mediums, and he made his son pass through the fire, probably in the valley of Hinnom. When Judah finally fell before Babylon in 586 before Christ, the prophets interpreted the exile as a direct consequence of these practices accumulated over centuries. But what happened during the exile is significant. 70 years in a foreign land accomplished what centuries of prophetic warnings could not. Far from the destroyed temple, far from the promised land, the Jews were forced to rethink their faith in a fundamental way. How to worship a God linked to a temple when the temple was ashes. How to maintain identity when everything that defined them had been torn away. The answer came through a silent revolution, the emergence of synagogues, the centrality of the scriptures, the construction of a portable faith that did not depend on place or sacrifice. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah, something had fundamentally changed. The temptation to worship Baal disappeared. Asherah poles were never erected again. The classic idolatry that had tormented Israel since Canaan simply ended. The people who returned from exile were rigidly monotheistic in a way their ancestors had never been. The Judaism we know was born in this post-exilic period. But practices of spiritual manipulation did not disappear from the world. They only changed form. In the intertestamental period, between the Old and New Testaments, magic continued to flourish in new configurations. When Jesus was born, the region was filled with itinerant exorcists, diviners, amulet sellers, and practitioners of syncretic rituals that mixed Jewish, Greek, Egyptian, and Persian elements. The Gospels mention demonic possessions with a frequency that may surprise modern readers. Jesus did not deny the reality of evil spiritual forces. He confronted them directly, casting out demons with authority that amazed the multitudes. When his opponents accused him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, he did not say, "Demons do not exist." He argued that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Spiritual reality was presumed by all sides of the debate. The Acts of the Apostles continues this narrative. In Philippi, Paul encountered a young woman with a spirit of divination who generated profit for her owners. In Ephesus, practitioners of magical arts who converted burned their books of incantations, a value calculated at 50,000 pieces of silver. In Cyprus, a sorcerer named Elymas tried to prevent the preaching of the gospel. The early church was born in an environment saturated with practices that traced back to Canaan. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, articulates what Israel had experienced for centuries. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. The battle that began when Israel crossed the Jordan continued, only the field had changed, and the parallels are striking. Just as the Canaanites sought secret knowledge through the dead, the serpent had promised, "Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Just as the Canaanites tried to manipulate invisible forces through rituals, Simon the sorcerer tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit with money. Just as the Canaanites sacrificed the most precious to obtain divine favor, the New Testament reveals that God himself provided the ultimate sacrifice. Here is the inversion that changes everything. In Canaanite religions, humans offered sacrifices to manipulate distant gods. In the Gospel, God offers his Son to reconcile humans who could not approach by their own effort. The direction is opposite. The sacrifice comes from above, not from below. And because it comes from God himself, it does not need to be repeated. It is sufficient. It is final. Hebrews develops this contrast in detail. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. The altars of Baal demanded continuous offerings. The cross offers rest. The mediums of Canaan promise temporary and uncertain access to the invisible world. Jesus declares, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." Not through secret rituals, not through special priests, not through manipulation of occult forces, through relationship with a person. And as for communication with the dead, the New Testament presents something radically different. Instead of the living trying to force contact with the dead, there is the promise of future resurrection. Those who died in Christ are not available for consultation because they are not in a state of diminished existence in Sheol. They are absent from the body and present with the Lord. And a day will come when the dead in Christ shall rise first, not as shadows to be invoked, but as complete persons reunited with their glorified bodies. The difference is not just of method, it is of an entire cosmology. The Canaanites lived in constant fear of forces that needed to be appeased, spirits that could be irritated, gods that were capricious and demanding. The gospel proclaims a God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, not a God who needs to be manipulated, but a Father who takes the initiative to seek lost children. When you look at the abandoned altars of Canaan today, the ruins of Hazor covered in grass, the stones of Megiddo silent under the Mediterranean sun, the valley of Hinnom transformed into a wooded park in modern Jerusalem, where families have picnics where children were once burned, you see the end of a system. The gods who demanded the blood of children did not save their worshippers from the Assyrian conquest. The divinized ancestors did not protect the cities from Babylonian invasions. The fertility rituals did not prevent the droughts that history records, but the people who refused these practices still exist. Against all historical odds, the descendants of Israel survived the Babylonian exile, Persian domination, forced Hellenization, Roman destruction, 2,000 years of dispersion, medieval persecutions, the Holocaust. Nations that conquered Israel disappeared. Empires that oppressed them turned to ruins. But in synagogues on every continent, the same scriptures are still read that forbade consulting the dead and sacrificing children. And more impressively, the faith that was born in Israel has spread throughout the entire world. The gospel that Paul preached in synagogues and squares is today proclaimed in every nation on earth. 2 billion people identify as followers of Jesus. There is no contemporary equivalent to the cult of Baal. No one erects poles to Asherah. The names of Molech and Mot survive only in academic books. The spiritual battle that began on the hills of Canaan produced a clear winner. But it would be naive to think the struggle has ended. Forms change, principles remain. The temptation to seek spiritual shortcuts, to manipulate the invisible for one's own benefit, to sacrifice the precious in exchange for prosperity, this continues in new guises. There are those who seek mediums to contact the dead, spending fortunes on sessions that promise messages from beyond. There are those who sacrifice relationships, health, integrity on the altar of financial success, repeating without realizing the logic of Moloch. There are those who practice religions that promise control over destiny through correct rituals, right offerings, magic words pronounced in the exact sequence. The occult industry moves billions globally. Astrology apps have millions of users. Mediums appear on television programs. The quest to manipulate invisible forces has not disappeared. It has only modernized. The question Israel faced remains: in whom do you trust? In systems that promise power through techniques and offerings, or in the God who offered himself, who cannot be manipulated because he does not need to be bought, who does not demand the blood of his worshippers because he shed his own blood for them? The ancient prophets cried out, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." Elijah's question at Carmel echoes through the centuries, not because Baal still exists as a worshipped deity, but because the fundamental choice remains intact in every generation: life built on relationship with the Creator, or life built on attempts to control what we cannot control. The ruins of Canaan have been silent for millennia. The bones of the priests of Baal have long since turned to dust. The ceramic tubes that fed the dead are in museums, labeled and studied by academics. But the voice that called Israel out of Egypt, that guided them through the desert with a pillar of fire, that promised land and offspring, that warned about the spiritual dangers ahead, that voice still speaks. For whoever has ears to hear, and courage to choose. To help us continue producing these documentaries and biblical stories, consider purchasing our ebook with more than 50 prayers. It is a way to bless this project and, at the same time, have a spiritual guide for your journey. The link to secure yours is in the description. Until the next video.